Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
On today's program, we're going to talk about the declining effectiveness of Indiana's Democratic Party statewide. We're also going to talk about the Republican plan passed by the Indiana General Assembly that reapportioned legislative districts, much to the dismay of Democrats who are challenging the plan in court. And we're going to talk about Hoosier attitudes toward a free press. Our panelists for today's Public Affairs Roundtable include Ball State University professors Mark Popovich from journalism, commenting on free press in Hoosier land, Gary Crawley from political science, commenting on legislative apportionment Indiana style, and John Rouse from political science, commenting on the decline of Indiana's Democratic Party. Indiana still has a Democratic Party despite reapportionment, despite numerous losses at the state level. They are still active, Gary Crawley?
Oh, they're still active. They're alive and well. In terms of the reapportionment and the controversy that's going on right now, the latest major issue, I guess, to hit is that the Supreme Court refused to stay an order from a lower court, which would require, and now will require, Indiana to reapportion prior to the '86 election, sometime yet in 1985. And the whole question is over whether or not Indiana's state House and state Senate districts are gerrymandered, that is, drawn to favor Republicans and discriminate against Democrats. The importance of the decision is that the Supreme Court has never ruled on a political gerrymander in the sense of partisan politics. They've ruled that you cannot discriminate in the way you draw district boundaries on the basis of race, for example, based on the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So this will be somewhat of a landmark case, and the court will be hearing the case this coming year and render a decision.
Now, an intermediate appeals court, federal appeals court, did in fact support Democratic contentions that this plan was unfair, and if the Supreme Court does in fact uphold that decision, Indiana will be looking at perhaps a special legislative district or legislative session to redraw districts.
Which would be one way. That's correct. It'd be one way to handle it. They filed suit. Well, there were actually two suits. The NAACP and several other groups filed suit in February of '82 in federal court, charging racial discrimination in the way districts were drawn. That, in particular, multi-member districts, Marion County, Allen County, were drawn in such a fashion as to discriminate against blacks. And the Democrats in Indiana filed suit January of '82, arguing that discrimination on the basis of party. And then that court, whenever there's a challenge to a reapportionment plan, federal law requires a special, what in effect is a district court level 3-judge panel to rule on it. And they handed down their ruling, I believe in '84, arguing that, first of all, the racial discrimination, that suit was turned down. The argument being not that blacks weren't discriminated against, but they were discriminated against on the basis of party.
They were Democrats.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, okay.
So it wasn't a question of a racial discrimination, it was still party discrimination. And then they ruled in favor of the Democrats in challenging the Indiana plan.
John Rouse, when we looked at the legislative districts, the House and the Senate, we find out that Democrats, whether they're blacks or not, have really found out what the meaning of being in the minority in the legislature is. Being in a minority in the State House, for that matter, they haven't had a lot of successes statewide.
Yeah, for the last 37 years, or the last 19 elections, the Democrats have, on 10 occasions, have not won any of the 3 units, meaning the Senate, the House, or the governorship. So only in 1964 did they win all 3 units, the House, the Senate, and the governorship. And of course, that was the landslide election of Lyndon Johnson. So for the most part, in terms of the 19 elections, on 3 occasions, they won 2 of the 3 units. On 5 occasions, they won, meaning either the House, the Senate, or the governorship. So This is a historical thing. The Democrats have not done well statewide for the last generation or so. And I think the real problem here, Larry, is the fact that when you don't have competition, citizens lose.
The legislative districts, of course, and congressional districts are drawn by the legislature, which has tended to be Republican seemingly forever. Are Democrats losing these races because Republicans are drawing the maps, or are they losing because Indiana is a Republican conservative state?
I think to answer the question, it's probably a little bit of both. But I would say, first of all, that the Republican Party in Indiana has been very pragmatic. The Republican Party is not ideological from a real conservative point of view. They are pragmatic in terms of trying to answer the real problems that the people face. Also, I would say in terms of a turning point, Marion County, Indianapolis with Unigov was a turning point in establishing the real base for the Republican Party statewide. So they run from a very strong position in terms of Marion County, Indianapolis. Also in terms of the split in the Democratic Party, there's a split between, I would call, the Townsend forces, the traditional labor kinds of forces, and the more conservative business-focused personalities in that of Conrad and also Hillenbrand. And of course, the Democrats statewide have also had to suffer through the Reagan era. So if you're an individual Democratic politician, and the Democrats do run as individuals, if you survive the Reagan era, you've done a very good job for yourself. Also, in terms of recent years, say in the last 10 years, the Democrats have suffered, for example, from poor financing. They've also had this statewide loser kind of image, and in terms of these times, they don't have a general philosophy of government. So for all those reasons, they're in trouble.
What's the difference between, Gary Carl, you might want to answer this with John, what's the difference between an Indiana Democrat and an Indiana Republican? I mean, aren't they pretty much the same? How do you tell a difference other than when you look at the ballot and somebody's a Democrat and somebody's a Republican? We don't have really New York liberal Democrats, Eastern liberal Democrats. We have pretty conservative Democrats here in the state. What's the difference?
Well, I think, and of course it's subtle in a sense. I mean, there's nothing that jumps out at you. For example, there's nothing comparable to a Reagan-Mondale difference where it's pretty clear they're coming from totally different directions. But in Indiana, one thing you have to realize is that the moderate faction of the Republican Party is pretty well in control. And consequently, that's one of the reasons that the differences are subtle. I think primarily it's a question of Democrats would spend more for education, social programs, but probably not as much as the National Democratic Party would in Washington. So I think you'd see some more spending there. Beyond that, I don't think there's a great deal of difference. But I would point out in terms of the Democratic Party, you have a real split. In terms of the southern part of the state's much more conservative Democrats. Traditionally, historically, people that moved into that area were from the South, Southern Democrats coming up and bringing their traditional conservatism with them. And then from central Indiana north is much more moderate, even a few small pockets of liberal Democrats. So overall, though, the charge, in fact, has been made that Democrats present the ideas and then Republicans put them into practice 2 years later once they're elected. I don't think the differences are that dramatic.
John Rouse?
Yeah, to follow up very quickly, the minority party's responsibility is to raise issues. So as Wayne Townsend raised the issue of license branch reform this past time, he was bringing that to the agenda. Also, I would say, as Gary implied, the traditional breakdown between labor and management, between labor and business, has been a focus between Democrats and Republicans. So I think that has to have emphasis too.
Mark Popovich, John Rouse mentioned a few moments ago about Unigov and the impact of Indianapolis area Republicans on the party. A lot of people say it's because, one, Republicans control Marion County, but it's also the middle of media coverage for most of Indiana. The big television stations in Indiana, the biggest newspaper in Indiana, actually make Marion County Republicans household words throughout most of the state. Is the media responsible for helping this Republican dynasty continue?
Not totally, Larry. I think it plays a big role because I think traditionally the newspapers throughout central Indiana are considered to be more Republican-oriented than they are Democratic-oriented. And of course, they do have a great deal of influence on voters throughout East Central Indiana. But there's a number of other factors that come into play here too. And I think in terms of talking about economics and management and labor and things like that, I think one thing that I have seen is that I've seen the Republican Party make a greater effort to bring labor into their camp. And it's happened in the northwestern part of Indiana, and many of a lot of laborers, union members, generally feel that the Republicans, particularly in the past decade or so, have really helped them economically.
The Reagan Republicanism has been largely responsible for that, isn't that right?
I think that's basically true. And I think they're voting through their pocketbook now rather than voting through party affiliation or through union affiliation. I think the better off they are economically, and if they can attribute that to a particular party, I think they'll continue to support that party.
The Democratic Party base in Indiana is you're saying, perhaps fragile, and if they lose any segment of that, particularly labor, which has been the backbone of the Democratic Party by and large, they lose that, Indiana Democrats really have very little to go on.
I would agree, and I think it started. The biggest impetus came when Ronald Reagan came to office and put great pressure on unionism. And I think many union members are really insecure about their jobs, and I think that has helped to bring them into the Republican camp.
Yeah, if I can comment on the whole notion of Democrats and Republicans, to go back to the Supreme Court case or the question of gerrymandering. One of the things you have to keep in mind, in particular in Marion County, and John, you raised this issue, if you look at the 82-84 elections, Democrats get anywhere from 46 to 51% of the vote in terms of legislative candidates. But because of the way the districts are drawn, they end up of 15 state house seats, for example, they'll win 3. So they'll win 20% of the seats with nearly 50% of the vote. And that's part of the whole question of this gerrymandering, and I think it ties into the question of Republican control of the state, which you were referring to earlier. It doesn't obviously address statewide races, for example, but in terms of control of the legislature, it's going to make a big difference how those districts are drawn and whether you are indeed carving up areas to favor Democrats or Republicans, in this case Republicans. I was particularly intrigued if you look at the lower court case, and they asked Speaker Daley when he was filing a deposition, he was asked the question, what considerations did you take into account in drawing district boundaries? And his response was political. The follow-up question was, well, what were those political considerations? And Daley's response was, we wanted to help as many Republican incumbents win as possible. You can't be any more blatant than that. I don't think there's any question districts are gerrymandered in favor of the Republican Party. And I think that filters, in a sense, it filters up, if you can.
But this is no different from any other state. I mean,
no, it's not.
You have, in fact, California Republicans who are in the same place that Indiana Democrats are.
That's exactly
California
right.
Republicans are supporting Indiana Democrats in their suit.
I think you have an interesting situation where Indiana Democrats have filed suit challenging the plan, and I would guess that nationally Democrats are opposed to what they're doing, and the National Republican Party is very pleased and secretly hopes they win, because there are far more states that have Democratic legislatures with gerrymandered districts on party grounds than there are Republican. So it's a rather ironic situation in that sense.
Gary, with the Republicans in power, and even if the case does come out in favor of the Democrats, how really will they guarantee that they can get a fair redistricting?
Well, again, this came out of the case that I'm not sure there's any guarantee, first of all. I think it's the blatant aspect. I think what the Democrats want more than anything is to do away with multi-member districts. We have 16 multi-member districts for State House. And what happens in that case is, of course, you can carve up an area, elect 3 representatives, for example, as is done in Marion County. From that area, Whereas with single-member districts, you might have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. You get 3 Republicans because people still primarily vote straight party in Indiana. So I don't know as it's a question. I think what the Democrats want is to go to a 100 single-member district house, and then they'll take whatever they can get. I don't know how the court can guarantee that it'll be 50-50 in terms of party breakdown throughout the state in all districts.
Well,
I don't think that can be done.
The court has set down some guidelines in previous cases saying, here are criteria used when you're drawing your maps. Now, what Republicans did in Indiana was pretty much ignore the criteria.
Well, in a sense they did. See, most of the criteria the court has dealt with, aside from sex or racial discrimination, most of the criteria has to do with one man, one vote. It was established back in '64 by the Supreme Court, and even there they've never set a specific percentage difference between districts. What they've said is districts should be as nearly equal as is practically possible. And there have been follow-up court cases where they have allowed districting plans with as much as 10% variation between districts. So if they're not going to establish hard and fast guidelines for equalizing population, which can be done, then to go back to Mark's question, I don't see how they can establish hard and fast guidelines in terms of party consideration, because we have independent people who consider themselves independents. I mean, first of all, what do you use as a base for deciding who's Republican and who's Democrat? How they vote or what they consider themselves, and so forth.
There are still a lot of Democrats in Indiana, though. I think there are probably more Democratic mayors than there are Republican mayors. A lot of local officials, Democrats, and in fact, in this redistricting challenge in the court, does not include the congressional districts, because at the time we had, or the Democrats were happy with the fact that they had a majority or more at the time of those congressional seats.
That's right.
So the Democratic Party is not
and the thing we should emphasize is the fact that Democrats do very well at the local level, and but as far as the congressional candidates are concerned, personalities like Phil Sharp, for example, they have to run in districts that have been set by the Republican state legislature. But let me get back to Gary's point or question. Gary, the thing I'm concerned about is that the average citizen, if there is indeed an average citizen, really doesn't understand all this buzzword about gerrymandering and these legal terms and this constitutional kind of thing. Can you tell us more in terms of trying to get underneath some of the legal jargon? What's the constitutional base for all this discussion?
The basic issue in the Constitution is the 14th Amendment, which provides for equal protection under the law. And what people essentially are arguing, well, first of all, the case was one man, one vote. I mean, the decision had to do with malapportionment, Supreme Court decisions, where you had districts with 3 and 4 times as many people represented by a representative or congressman or senator versus other districts with that senator representing 1/3 of the same size. So the whole question was, if there are 3 times as many people in the district I live in, then I am underrepresented because I only have 1 vote in Congress or in the State House, and this guy in the other district with 1/3 the population, he has 1 vote, so he has more influence than I do. Now the question is becoming, well, even though you have equal population, you can still draw district boundaries in such a fashion as to take a pocket of people who happen to be Democrats or Republicans and split them up and dilute their vote and put them in the other party's district, so the other party's going to win. So you put as many Democrats
as you can in the district in Gary, Indiana, and that will take care of so many of the Democrats.
That's correct. And so the whole idea is you carve up this Democratic stronghold, for example. Give them a couple seats, but spread them out so that Republicans will win in 3 or 4 other districts.
The case, for example, here in the 2nd District, the attempt would be to try to put as many registered Republicans in Phil Sharp's district as possible,
they did, as a matter of fact.
So he'd have a good chance of losing next time.
That's right. But as kind of a follow-up, now you were talking about statewide Republican control. I think one point you have to consider is there are no strong statewide Democrats, at least on the horizon, that I can see. I mean, that would be my argument. If you come up with a charismatic candidate, because in a statewide election there's much more personality and so forth involved, plus you have national coattails. And unless you get a strong, dynamic candidate I think the Democrats are going to continue to lose the governor's office, Secretary of State, and so forth.
But what about this year? Do you think that had the gubernatorial election been held in a non-national election year, do you think Orr would have been as successful this year?
Probably. No, in all seriousness, but that's my own bias. I did not believe that Townsend ran a very strong campaign. And I think, obviously, Reagan helped Orr, but I think Orr would have won.
To give a perspective to that comment, Townsend did get 47.5% of the vote in '84, and that was ahead of Hillenbrand at 42.1 and Conrad at 42.3. Mm-hmm. So Townsend, in terms of relative vote getting, did much better than the two previous candidates for the Democrats.
Well, there's going to be a need shift in philosophy of the Democratic Party, or are you saying, Gary Crowell, all they need is one good, charismatic, strong candidate who can be a leader and be a candidate at the same time?
That would be my argument. Yes, I think we've had a series of candidates that were unable to excite people.
But you're saying now that there are no prospects on the horizon. I mean,
not that I can see.
When Moses might have been
there was one.
Well,
But I think the point is, in a way, is that the liberals won. The liberals basically gave out of ideas about 5 or 6 years ago. And so for the last part of the 1970s, the liberals got so many of their policies legislated into action that there was nothing else for them to do. So they did not respond to the dynamics or the change of the times as the Republicans did nationwide and also here in this state.
didn't raise much money either, did they?
Well,
I mean, is that not
yeah.
a factor? I mean,
I think the problem is that once the Democrats come on with this loser image that they don't have a chance of winning or very little chance, they also have chances of getting money. And of course, let me emphasize, whether it's the issue with Moses or with any person running for office, the most crucial problem, I think, in the system is financing of elections. It is just out of sight, and it may really frustrate the system in the long run.
and the incumbents have a distinct advantage in that.
And although people say they're not pleased with Congress, they tend to be pleased with their individual Congress people.
We've talked a little bit about the 14th Amendment, Mark Popovich, a little bit about the First Amendment in Indiana. Are Hoosiers any different from other people in their recognition, appreciation of First Amendment rights?
I don't think so, Larry. I think generally most people are ignorant of the First Amendment and really...
Regardless of whether in Indiana or anywhere.
Whether in Indiana or anywhere, and really do not have a real grasp of the spirit of that amendment and really what it means to a democratic way of life.
For example?
Well, in Indiana, for instance, you can take a question of an open records, open meetings law. And people in Indiana don't realize that although the press takes advantage of that law is basically there for them as individuals. And sometimes the public feels that because of those kinds of inroads that the press has, or they sometimes come to the conclusion that law was written for the press, they fail to understand that they have a right as individuals to know how their government is functioning. We sometimes forget that government officials are actually working for us. We're not working for them. And since they are working for us, we have a right to know how they perform and how they carry out their duties on a day in and day out basis. We have a right to attend their meetings, and we have a right to look at their records. And the American public and the public in Indiana really doesn't take advantage of the fact that they have this privilege. And I think if they would, it would keep, as John points out, we're talking about political credibility here. I think it would keep our politicians a little bit more on the up and up.
Is it not the media's obligation to keep people informed of these rights? And of course, the media, newspapers, radio, television, see themselves as the eyes and the ears of the public. They go to public meetings. They search for public records. They use these tools, whereas the public does not. But whose fault is it the public does not know more about that? Is it government's fault? Is it the media's fault?
It's probably a little bit of everybody's fault. I don't imagine the government really cares a whole lot, particularly the politicians who are in power. But I think to some extent the media is at fault because they don't have enough time to publicize what their role is in society, and they don't take the time to do it, and they probably should, because it would be meaningful to the American public. The other thing is that the American public doesn't spend enough time watching politics or keeping abreast of the lawmakers in this state and in this country.
Mark, I think one of the more liberal pieces of legislation to come out of the legislature, a Republican legislature, of course, is this open records law. And it's my understanding that if I perceive a problem in terms of local government, that I have the right to go to a certain bureaucrat who heads an agency and say, I want information about this or that. Can you tell us more in terms of what I might be able to get from this person and what this person could say to me, well, I cannot show you this?
Well, it's a question of, first of all, I would probably argue about your term liberal law. It's not really a liberal law. It's basically a privilege of the public to see that information. It's not a question of liberal or conservative. But to get back to the second part of your question, an Indiana citizen, for instance, has the right to go into any governmental office. And I want to make a distinction between governmental versus judicial office. But they have a right to go into any governmental office and ask to see specific records. And the agency has an obligation to show those records to that particular individual. The law does not allow a citizen to walk into a government agency and say, let me look at all of your records. There has to be some specificity. And once there is, then the citizen has a right to take notes, or if the agency feels so inclined, can even provide copies of those records, sometimes at a nominal cost, to the individual making that request.
Well, Indiana really isn't a leader in this area. Dick Cardwell, the general counsel for the Hoosier State Press Association, who was involved quite a bit in drafting and lobbying for the law, says the open records law is maybe a C+ when you compare it to those open records laws of other states. So I think you're right, Mark. It's probably not a liberal piece of legislation by any means.
Quick question. Did the media in the hostage situation contribute to that situation, in your opinion, by extensive 24-hour coverage, in a sense?
There's no quick answer to that quick question, but to some extent that they did. There were ways that in their eagerness to get the news story, and of course it was a news story, and it was a very important news story, and the media would have been remiss in not covering it. But in their zeal to cover that story, I think they took certain liberties with the hostage situation and with the relatives of the hostages, which presents an ethical dilemma
We're
for
out
journalism.
of time here today. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists, Gary Crawley, Mark Popovich, John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
Liberal in a context. I mean, it's liberal for Indiana,
Well,
at least.
Well, the law says it's supposed to be liberally construed, so
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them
But it's really not a
to
liberal
John
law.
Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producer is Mike Seaborg. Public Affairs Roundtable is a production of the Department of Political Science and public radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.